Good evening. Shannon Clausen here to give my presentation on the Church and the South African apartheid. More specifically, the Dutch Reformed Church and their impact and influence and involvement in that session. I don't have time to get into the reason why I chose this topic, except that in our current political state, it's very important to understand the place of church and state and how we interact, and also the church's job of upholding dignity and self-worth and the sanctity of all human life. So that's one thing to keep in mind as we go through looking at the Dutch Reformed Church's stance and take on these segregation policies and the apartheid movement. So my questions were, and I really had no clue beyond what the average person would know about the apartheid as I went into this project. So my questions were pretty vague. What was the Dutch Reformed Church's involvement in the Afrikaans culture and subsequently the formation of the National Party? What role did Calvinism have in the DRC and the Afrikaans culture? Who were some of the key leaders in the DRC that were also a part of the NP? Were the DRC leaders against? Were there any DRC leaders against the apartheid in the National Party? And what role, if any, did the DRC have in reconciling and ending the apartheid? So as I got into my research, I realized that I had to spend a pretty hefty portion on the history. We can't understand why people act the way they do if we don't know where they've come from. So what I'm going to do quickly is just give a brief overview of the apartheid just to refresh our memory and then get into some Dutch culture, the heritage of the people before we get into the actual apartheid period. So just to give some definitions, the word apartheid comes from the Afrikaans word for, it's the Afrikaans words for separateness. And the apartheid was a social, political, and educational, economical system of segregation and discrimination in South Africa during the 1948 to about 1994. And an Afrikaner is a Dutch-speaking African, so it's somebody who's of a Dutch descent. So that's kind of that. So the political, the situation in South Africa prior to the apartheid, we had the British imperialists who had power over this nation. We had the Afrikaners, which were the Dutch minority group that were struggling for their identity, and then we had the majority, the native black population. Everybody struggling to keep their identity and have a say. So we have this clash and this conflict happening, and we have this minority group, these minority whites, really having power over the people. And during this time, the Afrikaners, who were so firm in their belief that they were a chosen people, they felt that their culture and their heritage and ethnicity was being challenged during this time. And at that point, we see the rise of the Afrikaner people, and they establish this national party to look out for the interests of specifically the Afrikaners, but whites in general. And we saw this implementation of segregation policies that were heinous beyond belief. And we'll see how they justify that as we get going further. So we're going to look at how the Dutch came to South Africa. The colonial period was about the mid-1700s. The DRC, they were simple, pious people, fairly illiterate, and they were working to colonize the area, farmers. At the same time, the British were also colonizing South Africa. The British and their imperial forces were really nothing that the Dutch could handle. So that was a big, huge threat and a fear, a genuine fear to the Dutch. Also, the natives, the black resistance of the Dutch coming into their territory and taking it over to farm and live, that was a huge fear and a threat for this colonizing nation. So as the British gained more control, the Dutch sought to escape and get some more space so that they can form a republic. They did that. They went to the east. They formed a republic, and for a portion of time functioned in a way on their own without the interruption of the British. The British continued to grow in their control and looked for control of the mineral mines, the gold and the diamond that were on the territories and in the republics that the Dutch had formed. The Dutch were conquered in 1902 by the British and lost their independence, lost their ability to self-govern. They were given possibly some minimal self-governance. The good thing for the Dutch at that point was that both the Dutch and the British agreed on white supremacy and segregation laws. They both thought were looking to protect white political and economical interests. So we see this this tension between the two, but we also see kind of this breath or this relief. But we see the blacks forced into work for low wages and accept this form of segregation. And I'm using the word blacks for the purpose of this presentation because it's difficult to understand Afrikaans, Africans, natives. So that's just the word that's going to be used for the natives. So in 1910, we see that the British actually form a union. So the country of South Africa was formed. We see that segregation policies came into effect at that point. We see that the blacks could not own land, have freedom to travel, or enjoy job security. And this kind of became the basis for the apartheid system that we see further developed by the Afrikaners during the apartheid. The one thing that the British were hoping for during this time was a denationalization of the Dutch so that the Dutch would become less Dutch and more British during this time. And so with that, we see kind of this influx of nationalism with the Afrikaners. They were afraid to lose their identity as an ethnic group. They kind of start to form organizations and establishments that supported their culture and their pride, their language and their arts, and they had schools, and we see also this pushback against the British oppression was one of their major things. During this portion of time when the British were in rule, we see that the Afrikaners establish this national party in 1914, led by Hertzog, which was an Afrikaner, and it was supported by both the DRC and the Afrikaners. So the DRC, during this time period of about the 1910 to, let's say, about 1940-ish or so, started to develop this theology of apartheid. They use neo-Calvinism, the Neo-Fichtian ideologies of the culture, nation, sovereignty, election, those sort of ideologies, and they found scripture. They used Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel, where the talks about distinct languages, and Acts with the Pentecost and speaking in distinct languages. So we look at these themes of election and calling and diversity as their reasons and their theology that they actually believed that God wanted people to be separate. So in 1948, Daniel Mlana, who was a former DRC minister, won the election under the National Party to be president of South Africa. And with that, we saw an increase of the segregation policies. And I have listed here on this PowerPoint presentation a number of policies that were enacted that were completely dehumanizing, not just to keep diversity within ethnic groups, but really a lot of suppression. And so if you want, you are welcome to talk to me or look up some of these acts and see how far they go. But these are all policies that the DRC affirmed as they were leaders, as they were married pretty much to the National Party during the beginning height of the apartheid. As we come into the end of the apartheid, The National Party actually was moving toward dismantling the apartheid policies under the leadership of de Klerk, who actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work at working toward a democracy within the nation. At this point, the DRC still did not denounce the apartheid. They had major divisions within the DRC, and they were really afraid of a catastrophic church split. They did not want to lose their people, so they were afraid to commit to either side because they had a division. They were also afraid of a black majority vote. They were afraid that they would lose out on their political and economical interests if blacks had the right to vote. And they also believed in the theory of apartheid. They believed that it was a biblically based mandate for God to keep us separate. But as we can see, in 1994, the African National Congress got into office. Nelson Mandela won the election. He was the first black president in South Africa. He was able to establish a democracy and abolish the apartheid policies and start to work toward reconciliation in the country. So this has been a really difficult and continues to be a difficult topic to research. It's heartbreaking because when you see the church so firmly believe that Scripture supports something that so obviously and blatantly is wrong, it really is really discouraging. You see that fear is the motivating factor for a lot of these movements that are just heinous and wrong. So my conclusion, kind of what I realized and what I've proven through my study, is that the Dutch Reformed Church was a vital influence in the implementation of the apartheid, which was enacted to promote and protect the white minority, specifically the Afrikaners, from the black majority in politics and the economy. With their theology of apartheid, they confirmed it in scriptures, and they believed that segregation to be God's will. And the implementation of the segregation policies was to protect all ethnic groups and maintain diversity. That's what they thought they were doing. The DRC controlled the South African government during the apartheid years, with almost every president being a member of the DRC. The DRC's firm belief in biblically based segregation caused them to kind of lag behind in the political reform and dismantling of segregation policies that had crippled the nation since the dawn of the apartheid. And my final thought is, I know this isn't my thesis or doesn't have much to do, but fear is a powerful motivator. It has been used to create extraordinary beauty and good, and we all know that to our great pleasure. It also has grievously been the motivator for some of the world's greatest evil. And not to end on a gloomy note, but we can use fear to motivate us to do good things or to compel us for bad. And clearly the DRC used this fear of losing their identity in a way that caused such atrocities beyond something that really we could never even fathom or imagine. So I look forward to going through your presentations, and I really thank you for putting in the time and effort and doing the hard work of formulating your presentations. I thank you in advance.